Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
It's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, September 26th, is the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons established by the United Nations General Assembly. Leslie Sussan is a Maryland lawyer whose father was a U.S. Army videographer in World War II. She joins Dr. Josh Sharfstein to talk about how he came to take film of the aftermath of the dropping of atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how that film was classified top secret by the U.S. government for decades, and how the film is now being used today. Let's listen.
Leslie Sussan, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you.
So we're here because of your interesting connection to the 80th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Can you explain that connection?
Yes, my father as a young man was in the Army during World War II and arrived with the occupation in Japan and was assigned with the Strategic Bombing Survey to film with a crew the aftermath of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that experience changed his life. And I followed his footsteps to try to understand what had happened and spent a year in Japan interviewing people that he had filmed and learning about the atomic bombings.
So tell me a little bit more about your father.
My father was a child of Jewish refugees. He felt he had a debt of gratitude to the country, and he loved movies and films, so he had taken cinematography at the University of Southern California, which was then a very rare and exotic thing to do. And when he joined the military, he was assigned first to the studios, Culver City Studios, with Ronald Reagan as his commanding officer. So the military was aware of his background in cinematography. And then he was shipped out to the Pacific Theater of Operations and ended up in Iwo Jima under kamikaze attack just off the coasts of Japan. So once the war ended, he was sent to Japan.
Tell me more about this assignment.
This was part of the Strategic Bombing Survey, which had a mission of recording essentially how effective strategic bombing was, because the bombing of civilians and cities was controversial even then. And so as part of that, they decided to film the bombing of the cities in Japan. And they requisitioned all the color film in the Pacific Basin to do it and went first to Nagasaki. The orders were directly presidential orders signed by the president, and they began filming. Much of the crew was interested in filming the physical effects of the bomb as they radiated out from ground zero. But my father and Harry Mamura, a Japanese-American filmmaker, in the crew were struck by the horrors they saw in the hospitals, which were very different from in other bomb cities where by that time, which was already a couple months later, people were either dead or healing. In Nagasaki, they were getting sicker and sicker.
How much time had passed since the bombing until your father arrived in Nagasaki?
The bombing was in August, and the crew arrived in late December.
So several months later.
Right.
But he saw the effects still in hospitals, and you said that it changed him. Tell me a little bit about what he was expecting and what he saw and where that left him.
I think my father, like most soldiers, was thrilled that the war was over and knew nothing about atomic bombs except that we had a special bomb, and thank God it ended the war. So he didn't have an expectation that it would be any different than seeing other cities that had been bombed, which they passed through. And he expected, that it would be just an interesting assignment. And exactly what you said about the hospitals were horror shows is what shocked him. He had not seen a lot of close-up war. They'd been under fire, but, kamikazes and stuff. So part of it, I think, was the shock of seeing these victims. And they were children and civilians and women, and their skin was burned away. Their faces were melted, and they were covered with the spots. They were sickening from radiation poisoning, and he didn't know what that was at all. And he assumed that the U.S. had not had any idea what would happen, and that it was very important to record how terrible this was. And by the end of the time in Hiroshima, he believed that this footage would be made into some kind of movie that would be shown to the American people, and then they would understand that these weapons should never be made or used again.
So his horror at what happened changed him in a way and made him very eager for his images to be shown to people so that they could also experience that change. They could realize that this is not a weapon like others and that it caused devastating harm to children, to civilians, and to the whole city.
Yes, I think that pretty much sums up the change while he was there. He became, I think, also really came to care about Japan and Japanese culture because he got to know people. So they weren't kind of a faceless enemy anymore, which, is a change that was important to his seeing this. But yes, I mean, the weapons horrified him and shocked him, and he thought that's what he would be able to show everybody else.
Right, but as your book makes clear, that's not how it turned out. Tell me what happened.
No, when they returned to Tokyo, he was faced with immediate orders to return to Washington by the fastest possible means. Much of the footage had already been taken. There was some still there. He was to bring it with him. And so he flew directly on military flights, which in those days had to make stops, but without getting a chance to rest anywhere, to Washington, where eventually he was told the footage could not be used. It would not be of interest to the public. And in fact, it needed to be classified, and it was classified top secret. And it stayed that way for decades. And he spent years of his life trying in different ways to get access to himself, even to the footage that he had shot. It was used only for training films to teach soldiers about atomic bombs, but it was never allowed to be shown to the public. He even wrote to Harry Truman.
Did your father ever talk to you about his frustration not being able to have access to the footage that he took of the aftermath of the atomic bombs?
He talked a little about how frustrated he was, usually when one of his efforts, he'd have a friend with top secret clearance who would try to get him access, or over the years, he talked to Chet Huntley, I believe it was, and just made many efforts, and he would become depressed and frustrated. What he didn't really tell me is why it mattered so much. He didn't tell me any of the specifics of what he had seen or what his experience was. He had some still photographs that he had been able to take when he left the Army, but he didn't want us to look at them. He was afraid the FBI would come and seize them if we let anybody know he had them. He became, I think, depressed and paranoid and sad, and I see it as a kind of PTSD, which no one understood then. When he first got back to Manhattan, he spent a year walking through the city having flashbacks, I guess you could call them that, flash forwards of what Manhattan would look like after a bombing. He identified Manhattan with Hiroshima very much. It was a similar commercial city, and he would see a person's shadow on some steps suddenly in New York. So he was deeply affected.
Now, eventually, those pictures did become available, and the films.
Yes, that's right. So eventually he encountered a person at the United Nations from Japan who was showing some of their still black and white footage, or photographs. And talking to them, they learned from my father about this is the only color film footage of the aftermath. Learned about that. They started a grassroots movement in Japan and pressured the United States government, which then said, oh, but they're in the National Archives, just not cataloged, so no one could reach them. They're there now. They're now cataloged. Anyone can go to the National Archives and request to view them. It's almost 90,000 feet of film, so it's a lot. You can see some of the most chilling excerpts from it in a film called Atomic Cover-Up, which is available through PBS.
What year was that communication made about their availability in the archives?
My father met the Japanese filmmaker, Japanese exhibitor, Tsutomu Iwakura in 1978. And I think within 2 years, he had succeeded in getting acknowledgement that the films were in the National Archives and getting access to them. He bought a copy of Mr. Iwakura did, of the entire footage and used it to track down survivors who were filmed in it so that we now know who many of them are. And that's how I was able to meet many of them.
Tell me a little bit more about your trip to Japan.
So I went to Japan in 1986 with my daughter, who was just 4 at the time, and we lived in Hiroshima for a year. It was a cascade of serendipity in which people helped us connect to survivors who talked to us about their experiences, talked to me, and I used a translator. My Japanese got better as I was there, but certainly limited. Talked to us about what their experience had been at the time, but also how that had affected them throughout their lives, which was just really important. And many of them said they didn't like being filmed. The idea of being on camera with a strange, tall white man with big blue eyes, looking at them at the worst moment of their lives was upsetting. Although several said they thought at the time that he had kind eyes, which was nice to hear. But that in the end, they were grateful that this record existed so that young people could really understand what this was. And the ones I spoke to, they're called hibakusha, the bomb-affected people, the survivors, have been dedicating much of their lives to trying to stop nuclear weapons. And as you know, they recently received Nihon Hidankyo, which is the hibakusha Association, recently received the Nobel Prize for Peace for their work.
So it's 80 years later. This story has really become a story integral to your family. If your dad were still here, what do you think he would want people to know?
I think he would be glad that at least the story and some of the footage is finally reaching people. I think he'd be heartbroken that it took this long, but he'd want people to know to not let it be another year before we face up to the horror. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has set what they call their doomsday clock at 89 seconds to midnight. That's the closest it's ever been, closer than after World War II, closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have nuclear-armed countries at war now and referring to their power to use nuclear weapons. I think my father would issue yet another plea that it not be allowed to continue.
Leslie Sussan, thank you so much for joining me to talk about your book, your father, and the 80-year anniversary of the atomic bomb's use in Japan.
Thank you so much for letting me have this opportunity.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.